Welcome into Future Fit Leaders. I'm Zane Inglis, founder of Enhance, your trusted partner for training, coaching, and consulting solutions.
And I'm Ryan Sheppard, headhunter and author of Sell Yourself Like a CEO.
So in today's session, let's get right into it. We're talking about communication, one of the most vital skills both Ryan and I see as being a core success factor for any Future Fit leader. So Ryan, what are some of the reasons behind you focusing in on communication being a core skill?
Yeah, well, it's such a broad word, right? Communication. What does that mean? It can mean so many different things to different people, but in the context of being a future fit leader and the kind of leader that's fit to lead globally in this day and age, amidst all the volatility and uncertainty and ambiguity out there, the tariffs, for example, is like a wrench in the works that is poised to rework the global economy. I just spoke to a client yesterday saying that they're going to have to rework every contract with suppliers because of the flow of goods and how they work, how the USA is intertwined with that. So it really highlights communications, if anything, as an underrated skill. And this doesn't just mean about being able to speak English or speak multiple language, but how to communicate clearly and with impact across borders. So there's a few things that come to my mind when I think about what makes great communication. One is keep it simple, right? We don't all have to be speaking like an academic to be able to have impact. In fact, quite the opposite. The best adhered to instructions are extremely simple and extremely clear. But when it comes to communicating something more influential, there's really two key components that I've observed to be applicable to anyone. One is specificity, right? So being specific about who, what, why, when, where, how. The journalists use to tell stories, and storytelling in itself is such a powerful way to communicate because you're able to wrap up a person, a place, a time, a what, a how, and a why, all up into less than a minute. And with today's attention spans being barely enough to last to the end of a TikTok, being concise is paramount. So, using data fact to be able to anchor a conversation or anchor a point so it's relatable, so it resonates with people and they can be kind of drawn into that moment and grasp the point that you're trying to get across is one thing. And using stories helps to do that. But it's still easy to ramble. And so there's two frameworks I've observed that executives use, whether consciously or unconsciously, to be concise. One of them is an interview method. It's called STAR method: situation, task, action, result. It's also labeled as show, don't tell. So not just saying that communication is important, but giving an example of how communication is important. So one example of that is in interviews when you're asked to share a situation where you had to work with someone difficult or overcome a challenging situation or whatever the competency might be. S is for situation, when I was at such and such company. T is for the task. I had to describe the challenge. A is action. So what I did was ABC or utilized such and such principle. And R is result. As a result, and then insert a number or a proof point. And that's really where the impact happens. They've been able to relate to the situation or at least grasp it, right? Because of the specifics there. And then the result really comes in as a proof point to drive that message home. So be specific, use facts and data. 2, be concise. And a way to do that is to use some of these frameworks, not just for preparing for an interview. These can be used in any situation in life. Short, concise, and simple.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You'll notice that in our podcast, we always try to give a definition of the topic we're talking about because, as Ryan said, communication is really broad. In pretty much all of my sales or leadership trainings I do over the course of my projects, I'll focus on eliminating ambiguity and assumption. And managers will often say, you need to improve your communication skills. In their mind, they're thinking of, you talk too much and you don't ask enough questions. But the person who's being told that may be thinking, maybe I'm talking too fast. So we're not having this aligned understanding or definition. So when we come up with a list of skills that they think is necessary to improve their leadership or their sales, I'll ask them to write down their definition of communication without talking to their partner or anyone in the room, and I will gamble $200 per person that they won't all write the same definition word for word, because it's just assumed. 99.9% of the time, people's definition will be related to them talking to someone in a one-on-one situation. But communication could be one-way communication, a sign or a placard is communication, right? So it's really important, as part of your communication is to define what the definition is or topic is you're talking about, and don't assume everyone understands. So it's really good that you gave some specific examples there so people sort of visualize that you're talking about a leader communicating with someone else directly, not a one-way communication like a board. The other one is like being concise and simplifying your message, and the story that popped into my mind, or the example, was Steve Jobs when he launched the very first iPod. People probably under 45 won't empathize with this pain, but back in the day when we're driving a car, we had to listen to music on CDs, and you could only burn about 12 songs on a CD. And Steve Jobs gave this really long technical explanation of what an iPod was, and everyone's eyes kind of glazed over, and he said, put simply, this is 1,000 songs that fit in your pocket.
Yeah.
And to kids today, they wouldn't understand that, but at that time, that was 100 CDs that you could fit in your pocket, right? So give the technical explanation, but then simplify it, as if you're telling your grandmother or an elementary age, school age kid, to make sure that everyone understands.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And that goes back to features versus benefits, right? I have such and such years of experience, or our product has this feature, but what's the benefit to you? 1,000 songs in your pocket. No, that's 4 words.
That's what
Huge
I call
impact.
the so what. What's in it for me?
Yeah.
Particularly if you're dealing with non-technical experts, right?
Yeah, and that's why I think part of communication is also listening and asking before trying to impose an idea or think that you have the right solution, right? It's asking questions and being curious to ask the right questions, broad, open, exploratory, probing questions to really understand a situation, whether it's an underperforming team member or it is another department that you're trying to get buy-in for your idea. This is particularly true for the enabling functions of an organization, right? The communications, the marketing, business development, PR, etc., and across borders as well. So, executives trying to understand Japan and how Japan responds to that. Even seasoned CEOs struggle with that, explaining why Japan is the way it is, for example, and coming up with facts and stories to illustrate something that's difficult, that doesn't always have a logical explanation, but it's very cultural.
The question point is really interesting, and this is not specific to Japan. It's quite common across the world, particularly in Japan. Is a senior leader will give a directive or present a strategy, and then they will say, "Do you have any questions?" So they ask a question, and of course everyone looks down and goes quiet, and getting them to think about what's a different way of asking that. And I will often suggest that pick a certain person or ask for volunteers, but if you don't get a volunteer, pick a certain person and say, what do you think would be most challenging about what I've just shared with you, or which part of it excites you most? And by assessing that person's ability to clearly articulate what they're feeling about what you've said, will demonstrate whether they've understood or not. So little techniques like that are really useful when you're asking questions, is asking the right question to elicit an answer that gives you more than just a 1 or 2 word answer.
Yeah, and a cheat sheet for that is the who, what, why, when, where, how. So if one can, in their mind, think, this question that I'm trying to ask, how can I ask this in a way that starts with who, what, why, when, where, or how? You will get more information. You will get a more substantial response, and therefore, information is gold, and you'll be able to have a much more intelligent follow-on to that. And also TED, tell me, explain to me. describe to me. So tell me about the personalities that you're interfacing with in your company, or explain to me the key challenges standing in the way of you and your goals, or describe the current culture in the team at the moment. These are the kinds of plugins that we can ad-lib to on the fly, convert whatever questions we have into one that's going to land a lot better and go a lot further.
Another one, in my experience, that's underutilized, particularly when leaders are giving a directive or instructions or sharing something important with their team, is writing it down. Too often you'll see, even in a senior leadership meeting, you've got a group of really smart executives, and the CEO will sit at the head of the table and he'll say, I need you to do X, Y, Z, and then wonder why it doesn't get applied in the way he anticipated or she anticipated. And a real world example of this is during the 2019 Rugby World Cup in Japan. I was flying between Tokyo and Osaka, and I was dressed in, and being from New Zealand, I had my New Zealand All Blacks rugby jersey on, and I'd used mileage to upgrade to business class.
Nice.
And the guy sitting next to me was this guy, he just, he smelt like a CEO. He had this smart suit on, he had that presence. And he started asking me about, where you're from. You're obviously from New Zealand, in English, because he was curious about rugby. And he explained his company was based in Colbert and they were associated with the Colbert rugby team. And in the space of 15 minutes, we got onto his role. And he told me that he was around about 12 months into a role as CEO with a new organization that was a very old traditional company. And I asked him, what are your biggest challenges through your first 12-month integration? He said, I sat back and watched my team for a long time, and they just seemed really busy. There was a lot of people doing overtime, and that bothered me. So I called in my leaders and I explained to them I wanted our team to learn to work more productively so they could go home on time. And he said then they all went away and told all of their team members I wanted them to work harder. He said, I can't understand why they did that. And I just looked at him and said, did you write it down? And he looked at me and I said, did you write down what you were saying to your team? And he said, no. And I said, have you heard of Dengon game in Japanese? I'm not sure the politically correct way to say this in 2025, but we used to call it Chinese whispers, where a kid gets a piece of paper and they tell the guy next to them, it might be green parrots fly to France. And by the time you get to the 10th kid, it's a completely different story, right?
Yeah.
But if you give that piece of paper to every person in a 100-person group, they will all say the same thing.
Yeah.
And he just looked at me. And he said, I never even considered that. And to the point I sold a 6-month project before we got off that plane because he hadn't thought about some of the most fundamental communication techniques.
Yeah.
Like writing it down so your team can't confuse the message or twist it.
Yeah, I've witnessed the exact same scenario. I wasn't on a business class flight like you were. I was just in the office with a president of a small company, and this guy was leading 50, 60 people or so, and he had the same issue with overtime, and he told his deputy, we don't want people working overtime, can you change that? Thinking that his deputy was going to then implement some sort of productivity system that's results oriented and encourage people to set deadlines so they can get things done before deadlines, and instead people just logged off their computer and went home at 6 p.m. and he was shaking his head. So yeah, write it down so that sometimes messages need to be conveyed word for word, because the syntax of it and the words used and the tone and everything is so crucial to delivering the core message.
A real world example of this is working with a company starting about halfway through COVID. And one of their biggest pain points was too much overtime. And for 2 years, the Asia Pacific heads have been saying, stop doing so much overtime, because a lot of it was paid. So people would say, stop doing overtime. We need to be more efficient. But no one had ever come up with a way to actually do that, but by putting a process in place and doing a bit of a time study, identifying which roles were being duplicated, we reduced 1,000 hours of paid overtime, and I think it was 9 months for a team of 20 or 25 people. If you actually think about these things rather than just saying do it, you'll be surprised at the outcome. So to summarize up, what we've sort of talked about here is clear and concise messaging. What am I trying to get across? What do I want the people to take away from this? not using corporate jargon, not being long-winded. So you talked about the STAR technique for that. Thinking about questioning, how you can ask questions to confirm understanding and to make sure your communication is two-way. Writing it down. And another one I liked you referenced was the when, where, why, what, who, how techniques for giving you structure around the way you're talking.
Yeah, we got a lot of distance covered there, didn't we, Zane?
We sure did. I'm sure we're going to refer back to a lot of these topics as we go forward in this podcast, because I think a lot of things link back to communication. And one of the reasons I think it's important is a lot of the CEOs or senior leaders we work with are very intelligent people, and they're used to communicating their messages up to people who are probably even more intelligent, so they get it. But it's the communication down that is often the most challenging, how you simplify your messaging. And we gave the example of Steve Jobs. Give you a technical explanation, but put simply, this is this. A message that everyone can get. And my suggestion would be, don't try and do everything we've talked about. Choose one, write it down now while it's fresh in your mind, and make a bit of a conscious effort to try and apply that over the next couple of weeks. And if you have any questions about it or some challenges, feel free to hit us up in the questions, the comment section here, or contact either of us on LinkedIn. Both of our profiles will be linked here in the bio. We're always happy to give you specific examples about how to overcome the challenge in your real world day-to-day life there, rather than just talking in theoretical terms.
Yeah, it would be great to hear from viewers. What's the one thing they took away from this that they're looking forward to implementing? Go ahead and comment that down below. Would love to know what you got value out of, so that we can be able to create content that's going to be even more valuable for you in future episodes.
That'll do us for today, guys. Look forward to your comments there. Look forward to seeing you back in next session. Thanks for joining us on Future Fit Leaders.
Thanks, everyone.